Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Discussion Bound. My name is Kristi McMillan. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Asheville Art Museum, and I'm joined by our special guest, Mary Campbell, PhD JD, so a doctor times two, who will be helping to moderate today's discussion of Beauford, Delaney, and James Baldwin through the Unusual Door. This book was edited by Stephen C. Wicks, and Mary was one of the contributors. A few notes before we get started. You probably noticed that your microphone and video were muted as you got logged on. We welcome you to turn on your video at any time, and in just a moment I will also make it so that you can unmute your microphone. Choose a quiet room and close the door. Please silence any alerts from nearby devices as they can be distracting during our conversation. If you do turn on your video, try not to sit in front of a window, lamp, or other strong source of light or movement, as it makes it difficult to see you. Use headphones and microphone for best sound quality. While you can log on using your smartphone, we do recommend using a desktop, laptop, or tablet in order to see slides and meeting tools and each other on a larger screen. Make sure that your screen name includes your first name and last initial or first name and last name so that we know who we're talking to. In order to ask questions, make comments, or otherwise contribute to the discussion during this hour, you can just unmute your microphone when Mary or I ask for questions or comments. You can also type your questions or comments into the chat box. A third way to participate is to raise your hand in the participant sidebar, and I'll call on you and ask you to unmute your microphone. This is a discussion, a conversation, so we do just recommend that you jump in. If you have questions or comments, that was absolutely fine to participate with the chat box or the participant sidebar as well. Finally, we are recording, so if you prefer not to be recorded, make sure that your video and audio remain muted and use the chat box to submit questions and comments. As always, I have a couple of guiding questions for us that we can talk about, but we don't have to, depending on what you guys are interested in and how the hour shapes up. But I just thought I'd share these with you before unsharing my screen. Always love to know what were your general impressions of the book. Before reading the book, had you heard of Beauford Delaney, James Baldwin? What was the most interesting, exciting, surprising, or otherwise-ing thing that you learned? This book was published in conjunction with a 2020 exhibition at the Knoxville Museum of Art, not too far from Asheville. And selections from that exhibition make up the Asheville Art Museum's current exhibition, Beauford Delaney's Metamorphosis into Freedom. How did the different points of view offered by the three essayists inform your understanding of the artist and his work? I love this quote. It was a quote that we talked about in docent training, so I'd love to talk about it with you further here. James Baldwin said, "I remember standing on a street corner with black painter Beauford Delaney down in the village, waiting for the light to change. And he pointed down and said, 'Look.' I looked and all I saw was water, and he said, 'Look again,' which I did. And I saw oil on the water and the city reflected in the puddle. It was a great revelation to me. I can't explain it. He taught me how to see and how to trust what I saw." Painters have often taught writers how to see, and once you've had that experience, you see differently. Another thing that we could talk about as you went through the catalog of the exhibition, which was more or less the second half of the book, was there a particular artwork that attracted you? Why? And can you share it with us? I thought that this word transnational or living transnationally was a really interesting choice of words that especially Stephen Wicks used. And I delved into it a little bit, and having read then the essays and also some of the quotes in Delaney and Baldwin, I do think it is like the right word. They lived transnationally between the US, France, and visited other countries in their travels. Though Delaney didn't consider himself an expatriate, which is the word that I would have used, but he had a very good reason for not using that word. He says, "It appears to me that in order to be an expatriate, one has to be in some manner driven from one's fatherland, from one's native land. When I left the United States in the 1950s, no such condition was left behind. One must belong before one may then not belong. I am no expatriate." thought that that was really interesting for us to discuss. And finally, Delaney and Baldwin's friendship lasted for 4 decades, with each providing the other with intellectual stimulation and personal support. Do you have friendships in your life that challenged you to be your best or do your best? And according to you, what are the keys to a good friendship? So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and I am going to introduce Mary Campbell, PhD JD. She is an associate professor of art history whose research focuses on the intersections of American visual, religious, and legal culture. Her current book project examines the religious impulses at play in the paintings and drawings of Beauford Delaney. I thought this was super interesting. A lawyer as well as an art historian, Mary continues to publish in legal journals and teaches a class on art law. She also takes UTK, University of Tennessee-Knoxville, students to Paris every July, although I bet you have missed a couple of years, Mary, where they study the history of Western art in the city's museums and learn to make really good macarons. I would like to be in that class, please. So what I'd like to do now is I'm going to make it so that y'all can unmute yourselves and participate in the conversation. But I think that, Mary, you wanted to start us off with an overview of Beauford Delaney.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for that introduction. And thank you just for having me here today. It's always such a pleasure to get to see, hey, other museums, this idea of a book club is just amazing. I think we need to be doing this in Knoxville. So thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, which you would think I'd be a little bit better at doing by this point. But I'm not. Okay, which are you? Let me see if I've got you on the right screen yet.
No.
Nope, not yet. No, that would be too easy. Okay, here we go. It's not like I haven't. Okay, let's do it like this. Presenter view. Are you seeing my slideshow yet?
No.
No, okay.
If you could just do a reshare, maybe.
Yeah, I think I'm sharing the wrong screen. Okay, share screen. Let's try this again.
There you go.
Okay, wonderful. Let's give this a whirl. Before COVID broke out, I was kind of a proud Luddite, and this has really been challenging. My engagement with the technology. All right, can you see my wonderful? Okay, so again, thank you for having me here today. My plan was just to kick us off, just to give you a brief overview of Delaney, the sort of major periods of his life and work, and then open it up to you for questions. But I want to make sure that we're all on the same page in terms of having a kind of basic knowledge of Beauford Delaney. Although if you've read the book, I would assume you would, but I'm assuming nothing right now. Okay, so actually just a show of hands. How many of you were familiar with Delaney before the show? All right, that's about right. He's an artist who essentially he dies, as you can see here, he's born in 1901 in Knoxville, Tennessee, in my adopted hometown, and he died in 1979 in Paris. And even though he had, from really quite early on, a really committed following of writers and other visual artists. So the more you work on Delaney, the more you realize he just sort of knew everyone: Georgia O'Keeffe, Alfred Stieglitz, Henry Miller, of course, James Baldwin, Romary Bearden. After he died, he really fell into art historical obscurity. And it's only been recently, I'd say since about 2017, maybe 2018, that he's really been coming back to a sort of art historical prominence. And a lot of that is due to the efforts of Stephen Wicks. Stephen has been a Delaney champion for decades now, and I think he's finally starting to see those efforts and that dedication rewarded. So I'd say about 4 years ago, the New York Times published an article saying that Beauford Delaney was returning to the scene. Hilton All's sort of public scholar, Columbia professor and a writer for the New Yorker, he's very invested in Delaney's work. There's been a fair amount of kind of action going on in terms of resuscitating Delaney and his artistic legacy, but we're still in the early stages. So most people tend not to be overly familiar with Delaney. And when they are familiar with him, it tends to be because of his connection either to the American writer Henry Miller, the two were friends for decades, or as a result of Delaney's connection to James Baldwin, another American writer and a huge figure in Delaney's life. And you see the two men here in 1966 in Istanbul. So just to give you the briefest sort of introduction to Beauford Delaney and his work. This is an undated photo strip from the Delaney Estate Archives, which live in the basement of the Knoxville Museum of Art. In terms of sort of basic periods, there are four. So he's born, as I said, in Knoxville, and he lived in Knoxville or in and around Knoxville. His father was a minister, and every once in a while he would move to a more rural area of Tennessee to preach to various flocks. But the family lived in and around Knoxville for all of Delaney's growing up. And by the way, it's pronounced Beauford Delaney. Scholars who haven't heard anyone say the name tend to get all Frenchy with him and call him Beauford. And after Baldwin moved to France, he started calling Delaney Beauford, kind of mixing the two. But when he was born, Delaney was known as Beauford. So he spends the first 23 years of his life living in Knoxville, Tennessee, and then with the help of a local artist named Lloyd Branson and a local educator and civil rights activist named Charles Chancellor, he moved to Boston, and he spent a fair chunk of time in Boston. He's there until November of 1929. He takes art class, and this is important. People tend to assume that Delaney was self-taught, that he was some sort of naive, self-taught artist. I assume that this is because he was Black and from the South, and it was incorrect. He took class well, he studied with Lloyd Branson in Knoxville. He took class all over in Boston. Often he was not allowed to formally matriculate into these schools because he was Black, but he was taking class there. It was the period where, as he referred to it, he learned how to draw the lines. And he spent just a huge amount of time in the museums of Boston. And this was a theme throughout Delaney's life. Every city where he lived, he was a complete museum and gallery hound, spending extensive time in pretty much every art institute he could get himself into. So he's in Boston, and he's hanging out really with a pretty Tony set of Bostonians, a fair number of white Bostonians who come from this line of Boston abolitionists, and then the really pretty elite Black Bostonians, very much involved with the Harlem Renaissance as it was taking shape in Boston. He became really good friends with the Harlem Renaissance poet Countee Cullen, and that was a friendship that was going to continue after both men moved to New York. So Delaney moves to New York in 1929. He gets there about a month after the stock market crashed, which wasn't super great timing, and he's there until 1953. After that, a number of his friends took up a collection to ship him to Paris. They bought him a ticket on the ship called the SS Liberté, or the SS Liberty, and Beauford touched down in Paris. And it was really, France was really his home base for the rest of his life. He made one trip back to Knoxville in the winter of 1969-1970 to see his family. And he also traveled all over Europe while he was in Paris, but he spent the rest of his life based in Paris. And I should just point out here, this is the sort of work that he was learning how to make in Boston and then continued to make during his early life in New York. These portraits that are much more sort of conventional and traditional than the type of abstracting portrait we associate with Beauford's later work. He also, during his time in New York, spent a fair amount of time in the West Village. He lived downtown. He was not uptown in Harlem, but instead was downtown, spending a lot of time painting Washington Square Park. He also worked on these increasingly abstracted scenes of the city, something like Green Street, and his New York studio was on Green Street. It was on the third floor in Green Street in Soho, when Soho was not the sort of place where, you know, it's now the kind of upscale shopping area where you can find the Mac store and all of that. It was really pretty gritty, and he was living there. So here is one of his images of Green Street from 1940, where he's really reducing the city to these kind of jazzy abstractions. You can still tell what you're looking at, but there's a sort of simplification, a sort of abstraction and kind of condensation of the iconography of the city. You find a lot of manhole covers, a lot of pigeons, a lot of fire hydrants in his work. And he also works on portraits. He continues this interest in portraiture, which is really going to be a touchstone for Delaney throughout his career, even though his portraits become increasingly abstract, and you start to see this in something like his 1944 self-portrait, they become much more interested in the kind of surface quality of the paint, of these thick lines. He remains committed to portraiture throughout his life. So that's his New York period, and just a handful of images. Touches down in Paris in 1953. He leaves on August 28th, 1953. And from that point on, his work is going to become increasingly abstract until he moves into what art historians refer to as pure abstraction, where you can no longer, you know, he's no longer trying to show you something from the outside world, but instead you get these really kind of exquisite plays of paint on canvas or board. And Delaney throughout his life worked in oil paint, watercolor, and gouache, which is a type of particularly thick, opaque watercolor. He didn't do acrylic. He was your man in oil paint. Would have been cheaper for him to do acrylic, probably would have been easier, but he was really committed to oil paint and stayed with that medium throughout his life. Kept going with portraiture. Here's his 1965 portrait of a woman named Dorothea Speyer, who was an American who ran a gallery in Paris, actually a couple of galleries. She worked for the State Department for a while, showing work at the American Cultural Center in Paris, then opened her own gallery during the Student Rebellion in 1968. Here you see the two of them in Delaney's studio in 1972. And of course, his ongoing relationship with James Baldwin is going to be a touchstone throughout his career. As you might have read, he and Baldwin met when Delaney was in his late 30s and Baldwin was 15. Baldwin was having a fair amount of trouble at home at this point. Relationship with his stepfather was really rough. He was at that point acting as a child preacher, largely to get away or to have a certain sort of agency, a certain sort of freedom from his stepfather. And things were essentially coming undone. And one of Baldwin's high school friends said, "I've been hanging out down in the village and I've run into this really fascinating African-American painter named Beauford Delaney. You should go meet him." So Baldwin, who at the time was 15, screwed up his courage and just, you know, showed up on Beauford's doorstep, went to his apartment building, Green Street, went on up. And here is this wonderful sort of description of it after the fact that Baldwin published in a 1985 article called The Price of the Ticket, where he describes meeting Delaney for the first time. And as he says, I was terrified once I climbed those stairs and knocked on that door. A short, round man came to the door and looked at me. He had the most extraordinary eyes I'd ever seen. When he had completed his instant x-ray of my brain, lungs, liver, heart, bowels, and spinal column, he smiled and said, "Come in," and opened the door. He opened the door all right. Lord, I was to hear Beauford sing later and for many years, open the unusual door. My running buddy had sent me to the right one, and not a moment too soon. And this is the passage where the Knoxville, the KMA took the title of its show, Through the Unusual Door. And it really gets to the sort of themes of movement and opportunity, and I think a certain exceeding of stereotypes and expectations that really characterized both men's lives. They were close for the rest of Delaney's life. And throughout their relationship, which was never sexual, I want to point this out, both men were queer, and Delaney, I think, really did have romantic and sexual feelings for Baldwin, but Baldwin made it clear that he was not up for that, and Delaney respected that. So you'll run into these kind of even art historical surveys that will just assume the two men were lovers. They were not, but they were essentially family for the rest of their lives. And they would go on and they would effectively try on all of the roles. So when Baldwin and Delaney first met, Delaney was very much a father figure for Baldwin. Baldwin described Delaney as his spiritual father. When Baldwin's stepfather died, it was Beauford who went, there's this great account that Beauford found Baldwin sitting in Washington Square Park, and Baldwin said, you know, my dad died. And Beauford just went back to his studio, put on a suit, went uptown, and went through all of these different apartments and businesses, getting money, essentially, to bury David Baldwin. So it was Beauford who helped Baldwin to bury his father. The two men would eventually have a more kind of fraternal relationship. So Baldwin moves to Paris earlier. He moves to Paris 5 years, I want to say, before Delaney did. And then Delaney moves to Paris in 53. And this is from one of Delaney's sketchbooks, which he kept throughout his life. They're kind of a mixture of diary and sketchbook and letters that he didn't send and to-do lists. And if you go through them, you'll find like endless, like crushed packets of cigarettes. They were really multi-purpose books. But one you find right before, as he was preparing to leave for Paris, where here he says, get knowledge, get wisdom, but with all you're getting, get understanding. You've got this map of the area called Saint-Germain in Paris, in the left bank. And so we're at this moment, of course, where it's like pre-internet, pre-email, all of that. So Delaney shows up in Paris knowing that Baldwin liked to hang out in the Saint-Germain area. So he's got this map of where to find Baldwin. And the kind of amazing thing is that it worked. He took this map, found his way to the Boulevard Saint-Germain, and when he gets there, Baldwin happened to be sitting at a cafe on the Boulevard Saint-Germain with his friend Mary Painter. And you can just imagine Baldwin looks up, and there's Delaney across the street, apparently looking down, perhaps checking out one of these puddles and all of the reflections. And apparently the two men were just delighted, and they kind of ran at each other in the middle of the Boulevard Saint-Germain, which is, you know, a good way to get yourself run over by like a Peugeot or something. But it worked out. And the two men really entered this kind of fraternal period of their relationship. And then increasingly, Baldwin would go on to take the sort of paternal role to act as Beauford's father. And one thing about Delaney, everybody loved him. So if you go back and read, his biographer is a man named David Leeming, who acted as James Baldwin's assistant and wrote a biography of James Baldwin, and then went on to write a biography of Beauford Delaney. Leeming will say that in all of his research for the biography, he didn't find one person who didn't like Beauford Delaney. There was something about him. He had that kind of old school religious charisma. This is from a woman named Michelle Legros, whose parents were both American. So Legros was technically American, but she spent her whole life, she's still alive, still there, living in Paris. And she knew Beauford when she was very young. Beauford started hanging out with her parents and even spending a fair amount of time with them. They had a bedroom for him when she was a child. And in an interview, she remembered that he was pure love. He really seemed like the sweetest thing that could ever exist to me. So Michelle Legros didn't speak much English, and Beauford spoke some French, but not a ton. But they had this very kind of like physical, loving relationship. Here's another description of Delaney. This is by a French abstractionist painter named Frédéric Benrat, saying he who wants to be a mediator must first be torn. And this is where we get into a sadder aspect of Delaney's biography, namely the fact that psychically speaking, he really was torn. So you can see here, in addition to those 4 big periods of his life, Knoxville, Boston, New York, and Paris, in July 1961, he had a major psychic break. It's not clear what Delaney had, but we know that he heard voices, and it got really bad in July of 1961. He tried to kill himself. He was at sea trying to get to Greece. He threw himself over the side of the boat, wound up in a Greek psychiatric clinic. They got him back to Paris. But it was sufficiently bad that in 1974, he was institutionalized permanently. He died in a French psychiatric clinic right by the Montparnasse area. Again, we don't know what he had, but he had these really horrifying auditory hallucinations. Here are some letters from friends describing his particular affliction. He heard his voices were always American. They always spoke English. They tended to come in groups, and they just essentially hurled the worst of straight white American hate directly into his head. And here over on the left is his prescription for a drug that's known as haloperidol in France, Haldol in America. It was one of the first antipsychotic drugs that we had, and he responded to it. It's often used to treat schizophrenia, although it comes with some really unpleasant side effects. But Delaney did respond to this medication. It would keep his hallucinations under control for a while until it didn't. And then he was institutionalized. And I suppose we don't need to linger on this. Delaney didn't really talk about his voices very much, and he didn't write about them very much in his journal. This is a rare exception, a journal entry from the very late 60s, early 70s, where you can see him talking about his voices, these très méchants, very wicked voices that would come to him in the night. And here is a pretty iconic, at least if you work on Delaney and Baldwin, image of the two of them at St. Anne's Psychiatric Clinic in 1976. So Delaney's story doesn't end on a particularly happy note. He's institutionalized in 74. He loses most of his memory. He doesn't make art anymore. He stops recognizing people other than Baldwin and a mutual friend named Bernard Hassel. And then in 78, he slipped into a sort of coma and was barely conscious for the last year of his life before he died in 79. Which point Baldwin didn't come to bury him, probably because he was so angry at him for having died, the way that children are when their parents died. But here you see Delaney in his journal way back in 54, talking about the way in which he took courage from silence, presumably the silence of his voices. All right, that was a rather extended introduction, since this is not just supposed to be about me talking. So I'm going to turn it over to you all to talk about the book and your impressions of it.
All right, thank you so much, Mary. Actually, would you mind unsharing your screen so that we
No,
can
not at
see each
all.
other?
That's
Excellent. Thank you so much. So just to get us started, Mary, that was a wonderful introduction. And again, I'm just wondering from you all, after having read the book or perused the book, it was also one of those books that I don't think you needed to read cover to cover. You could come back to or find things that you liked and read those. What were y'all's impressions of the book? And was Beauford Delaney somebody that you were familiar with before having read the book or visited the exhibition here at the museum or at the KMA last year? Feel free to jump in. Go ahead, Linda. You're muted. There you go.
Okay. I was not the least bit familiar with Delaney, although quite familiar with Baldwin and have read quite a bit of his work. The exhibition is so wonderful, and I wanted to just be there. So the book helped me continue to be there. And I thank you, Mary. It's just fabulous. But so when I look at his portraits, I go, that one's my favorite. And then I look at his abstracts and go, no, I love his abstracts. What a multifaceted, creative artist. And we learned in a docent training that he continued to do portraits even as he went into abstraction. And I think his portraits are incredible, as are the abstractions. So I like them both.
Thank you, Linda.
And I think it's important. There's a sort of story that gets told for very specific art historical reasons, that the sort of pinnacle of painting is abstraction, right? And that great artists eventually come to abstraction and stay there. And this is a fiction, it's a myth, it doesn't even have that much purchase anymore. But what you see is an artist like Beauford Delaney, he doesn't follow this model. He's actually very much like Georgia O'Keeffe in this way, who was constantly moving between abstraction and more figurative, more kind of representational work, but that Delaney consistently moved between the two. And the thought is now, and there's going to be a really interesting show in New York at the Rosenfeld Gallery in September, I think, that's going to be exploring this, is that there is a fair amount of overlap between the abstractions and the portraits and the later portraits. That not only do you have these kind of increasingly abstract backgrounds going on with the portraits, but that maybe some of the concerns, and Stephen Wicks gets into this in just a beautiful essay that he wrote for the catalog, that the concerns that run through the abstractions are perhaps the same concerns that run through a fair number of those later portraits. So it's always great to meet more people who love Delaney's work. So thank you.
Other comments? Your thoughts on the book? Discovering this artist? No one? How many of you read the book? Sandy raises her hand. Okay, so most of you actually. So the book was structured like an exhibition catalog, in that there was a foreword from David Butler, the director of the museum, sort of just giving an overview of the exhibition and the project. Kicked off with a really fantastic timeline, which was very helpful for me to sort of see the way that Baldwin and Delaney's lives intersected, but also those main events in their lives. And what I really liked about the timeline was information being included post-mortem. So after Delaney passed, and even after Baldwin passed, sort of then how did we get to the point where we are with this exhibition and the KMA collecting his work. Stephen Wicks's essay was more or less a biography, but also telling the story of the KMA's interest in this material and how they came to collect it. I didn't realize that the KMA was such a young institution, actually. You wrote about something, unfortunately, that we don't have in the exhibition, so we couldn't see the paintings in person, but was absolutely fascinating. You wrote about Delaney's portraits, self-portraits, question mark, of
Yeah.
Rosa Parks. And then there was a third essay, Beauford Delaney's repetition creates, that was kind of a creative writing exercise. I forgot to say that there were also 2 letters from the artist Glenn Ligon that were written sort of in celebration of how Delaney's works influence him as an artist and in appreciation as well. And then a catalog with absolutely gorgeous reproductions of the works in the exhibition.
Yeah, and these, I have to say, this show, and I think especially to have it in Tennessee and then to have it in Asheville, it's such a beautiful show, right? And the caliber of the work is so good, and the caliber of the exhibition, the catalog is really phenomenal. I think it's not, you know, what most people think of when they think of like, oh, a regional art show. I think this is really raising the bar on that, showing the power of these smaller museums.
Mm-hmm. And someone said, and I don't remember if it was David Butler or Stephen Wicks, had said that he's arguably the best artist that Knoxville has produced.
I think,
or maybe not even arguably.
Yeah, right. Like, I mean, I have to say, as a former lawyer, it's like, well, you know, like, who gets to say that? What's the evidence? But I think that's true. It's certainly in terms of artists with international recognition. If you look at the institutions that hold Delaney in their permanent collections, he's got work at the Met, he's got work at the MoMA, the Whitney, the Pompidou Center in Paris. He's got work in the Minneapolis, I can never remember
Institute of Art.
Yeah, he has work there.
MIA.
Yeah, yeah, right. So he's got work there. He's got work in Detroit. He is all over. He's also got, I'm just going to put this in Les Amis de Beauford Delaney. I'm putting this in the chat. There's a woman named Monique Wells in Paris who's an expat, even though she has a French name, who was absolutely blown away. She saw one of Beauford's abstractions and it just like brought her to her knees. And she's one of these people who just has energy to burn. So she started a foundation, the Friends of Beauford Delaney Foundation, that's doing really good work to sort of preserve his grave, to get his name put onto various street signs in Paris. And she's got an amazing blog with, it's just a resource, like anything you want to know about Delaney, including where you can see his work in abroad or in the United States. She's phenomenal. So I do think, sort of circling back around, in terms of recognition, and probably the sort of art historical importance of the work, I do think Delaney is the best we've ever produced.
Sandy, you had a comment?
Yeah, I have a question. You talked about there's concerns that run through his abstraction and with his later portraits. Can you tell me what those concerns are?
Sure. Let me, I'm going to go ahead, if it's okay, and share my screen again.
Of course. Go ahead.
This is probably the best way to do it. If you look at, I think I've got a comparison here that we can work with. View, presenter view. Okay, so if you look at something like, please tell me I have an abstract. Okay, so if you look at something like this, and this isn't the best because it's the screen itself, the reproduction is flattening it out. Plus, to really look, you have to essentially push your nose up to your camera, which is always an awkward scenario. But if you notice the sort of texture, the way in which he has created a really sort of bumpy three-dimensional surface with the paint, what painters call facture, you can see that these this same sort of tactility runs through the figures, most notably here in her clothing. Although if you see this in real life, it comes into the background as well. And what you can also notice, this is going, or something like this, where that same, it's as though the abstractions kind of congeal into a figure in the portraits and then come undone in the pure abstractions. And Stephen in his essay refers to it sort of as like a rupturing. But I think the more time one spends looking at it, and then also reading in his journals what he was trying to do with his work, the more I think you start to see that there is this interest in moving beyond just surface appearance, in trying to get to some sort of, I mean, inner essence sounds kind of hippy dippy in a way that I don't think does him any favors. But if you read through his journals, and a lot of people, there aren't that many people who've read the journals because he died without a will, and things are a little complicated when it comes to getting into the estate. But it initially sounds like just some sort of like art historical cliches about the human family coming together and unity and harmony. But I think the more you see that reiterated in his journals, the more you see the way in which he is really turning to his art to find a state of being with others that isn't so completely constricted by the sort of social norms of his time. And you think about him as a poor, queer, Southern Black man, and all the stereotypes that are brought to bear on him as a result of that. The way in which so many of the people he met would look at him and immediately clock him and be like, okay, you live in that body, you mean this. So I guess in lawyer terms, it would be like non-consensual imposition of meaning, right? Which is pretty much what stereotypes and beyond that race are. So he lives in this world where he is so constrained by these stereotypes, and then he's got some sort of psychiatric illness that's piping them into his head. And if you read through his journals, when he talks about people he really adores, or he talks about meeting people he really loves, he'll talk about a kind of breakdown of those boundaries. So he writes about meeting Henry Miller and how suddenly time didn't matter, clocks didn't matter. What he refers to as like the superficial necessities didn't matter. And he could just enter almost like a state of communion with the people he loved. And I think in a way, the paintings do that. And in the movement between the abstractions and the portraits, how the figures kind of come together and then expand into just pure color, and color that's not encumbered with these kind of racist notions we live with, that you see a sort of aspiration to unity and harmony in the paintings. And you can even see it here. So when Delaney's talking about his voices, you can see how he talks about how the voices are intended to frustrate the equilibrium in interfering with my health and my urgent work, or referring to himself as someone who's very one's inclusive facets of the human family. And you can hear that his mental state is disintegrating, how, individual words make sense, but as you get a little bit further into each sentence, they kind of collapse underneath you. But the interest in unity and family and love and a certain sort of like ecstatic merger, I think that you can see that in the abstractions and the kind of the coming together in the portraits. I mean, you don't want to put too much pressure on it, but I think you do see something of that kind of urge to get beyond just the sort of cliches we associate with like physical being. That was quite a long answer. Did that answer your question?
And Joey
that
had
was
pointed
wonderful.
out.
Thank you.
Sandy. Joey had pointed out the portrait of Ella Fitzgerald, and then I was thinking of the portrait
Yes.
of Charlie Parker from 1958, where it wasn't any sort of human likeness at all, but rather it was more sort of a capturing of sound and essence and
Yes.
aura, if you will, with color and brushstroke, and that, you know, he's taking that idea of sort of capturing the essence of someone to the extreme. I
Yeah.
love that.
It's amazing. And one thing is, when you read through his journals, you'll see there is a lot of attention to sound, whether he's talking about, you know, taking courage from the silence, but he writes out musical lyrics, especially when things got rough for him, when he was really lonely, or I think when his voices were really coming on. He'd write out the lyrics either to spirituals, and they tended to be call and response spirituals. So he's imagining a kind of sonic community, or he really liked the blues, and he was particularly fond of blues singers like Bessie Smith, these queer blues singers, and you get this kind of interesting like play of voices going on. He also, there's a fair amount of kind of notation that looks like musical notation. I think there is a really kind of musical quality to his work that brings us into some of these same concerns, like moving beyond the sort of stereotypes, the cliches, the really racist kind of meanings or demeaning meanings we read onto people's bodies, and trying to achieve some sort of community, some sort of merger outside of that.
When I look at the abstractions, the abstracted paintings and then the abstractions, I mean, it just says jazz to me. And when you when you and I spoke last week, you're like, let me tell you what you should have for music in the waiting room. You know, there's all of this really important music. You know, he was musical, and he, you know, part of the early meetings between James Baldwin and Beauford Delaney, Baldwin talked about sort of his introduction to his birthright of gospel and jazz, that he wasn't able to hear in the same way in his home that was really strict when he was a child. So look, you've even got a slide.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the thing. I'm actually, I just applied for a fellowship, and you know, these applications are also always kind of like an exercise in controlled lying of like, I think the book might look like this.
Mhm.
So I gave it a world of like, what could you look at every period of his work through the lens of sound, without just kind of reducing it to like, oh, it's musical. And the more I pushed on it, the more I realized I think you really can. And that you're absolutely right, Kristi, what Baldwin said about like, he walked into the studio, he walked into music, and it was his inheritance. And The Price of the Ticket, that 1985 essay, there are interviews at the Beinecke Library, or it might just be in the general Yale Library, that David Leeming did with Baldwin and then a bunch of Delaney's other friends as he got ready to write the biography. And you get in the Baldwin interview a much rougher, much less polished kind of initial iteration of The Price of the Ticket, where Baldwin talks about meeting Beauford and how important he was to him. And he talks about walking into all of that music and how the music was really a key to it. There was something absolutely central about that music. And I think this was true of Delaney's work really throughout his life. I wish I were like properly musically trained so I could like articulate it and actually get into it a little more formally. But even something like this, and this is a work that wasn't able to come to the Asheville show, which is unfortunate because it's just amazing. But I think it is going to be in that September show in New York City. It's Delaney's first portrait of James Baldwin, makes it when Baldwin's really young. He's like 16 years old. It's an unusual work for Delaney. Delaney was pretty, it wasn't just that he was modest, he was sort of hung up about his sexuality to the point of being sort of phobic. He was only attracted to men. He didn't have sexual encounters with men. They tended to be sort of one-off, even maybe anonymous encounters. And you don't find that many nude portraits or nude images in Delaney's work. Just sexuality was not kind of easy territory for him. So it's an unusual work to have a very young nude boy in his studio, but it's just this beautiful work if you see it. And you can see in the catalog, Delaney had it hanging in his studio. It's quite large, and it's called Dark Rapture. And actually, my theory is that it shares its title with this song that the Count Basie Orchestra recorded in 38 with Helen Humes, which called Dark Rapture, which also the song was associated with this movie, this really primitivizing so-called documentary about the Belgian Congo that also came out in 38 called Dark Rapture. Its French title, original title was African Magic. But this sort of playing with the title, the playing with the kind of primitivizing notions of Africa that you find in the movie, but you also going through Delaney's notebooks, you'll see he was sketching the Count Basie Orchestra at the same time. So there is this really kind of musical impulse at play in so many of his works.
I wonder, and this is 100% not at all the same, but I have really bad tinnitus.
Okay.
And so in order for me to sort of not hear it, I have to always have sound around me. And I wonder if that constant, that importance of music to him and him always having music on was a way to sort of distract his mind to not hear voices.
Not hear the voices. Yeah, I think it might have been. And I also, his biographer Leeming says that painting was a way for him to sort of keep the voices at bay. If you're interested in Delaney, the Leeming biography, it's called Amazing Grace, which was Delaney's favorite song. It's out of print. You can usually find used copies on Amazon, and I think Hilton Knowles is trying to get it re-released. But it's a really wonderful, if you're interested in Delaney, it's required reading.
I know that you and I were talking a little bit last week about parallels between Zelda Fitzgerald and Beauford Delaney. And one of the things that was part of her treatment in her latter years was painting as occupational therapy, and occupational therapy in the way that it, the actual meaning of the word, it's something to keep your mind occupied as part of your therapy. So that's interesting that he found it is sort of equally a way to keep the voices at bay. Sandy, you had a question.
Yes. What about the influences of Van Gogh with him?
And yellow. Yeah, absolutely. Brushstrokes and the bright colors and the color yellow, especially.
Yeah, absolutely. And he loved the color yellow. I have focused, just to be honest, at this point in my research, I've focused more on his debt to Matisse. The one who's really focused on his engagement with Van Gogh and who does just an amazing job is the scholar. He used to be a curator at the Guggenheim. Now he's on a postdoc writing. Levi Praumbaum writes about the way in which Delaney was really influenced by Van Gogh. And he's actually gone back. He gave an amazing presentation. There was a symposium that took place in Knoxville at the same time that we had the Delaney show. It was a couple weeks before COVID shut everything down. It became very close to being a super spreader event. But Levi gave this presentation where he looked at some of Delaney's works and compared them to Van Gogh works and looked at the way in which where Van Gogh would be sort of shouting out or using iconographic references to certain Japanese prints or even like textiles, but I think it was coming from a Japanese print. Delaney was doing something very similar, but he was using African masks. So even there, that Delaney is so kind of self-consciously aware of himself as an artist within this much longer art historical tradition, and is able to quote Van Gogh, but then switch it to an African mask to start talking about his own kind of emotional connections to the continent and his sense of a kind of artistic heritage. It is pronounced, and I think art historians are just now starting to really unpack the way in which he is working with Van Gogh. Just a great question.
So, Christina, you had talked about the eyes in Delaney's work. Do you want to sort of comment on what you found fascinating about that, and maybe hear what Mary has to say?
So, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. No, I really honed in on that, and I had to read several times what that really meant. When you look at some of the portraits, how he painted two different eyes in his portraits. One was the outer eye and one was the inner eye. And the only time I've heard that referred to, I take a regular yoga class, and afterwards we always do the relaxation, and the instructor will talk about the inner ear and open yourself to your inner ear and close your outer ear so that you can feel and see more deeply. So when I came across this, I am totally new to Delaney. I'm enthralled by his beautiful work, but I started thinking about that, the inner eye and the outer eye, and then his emphasis on seeing beyond what you see.
Yeah.
And I love that. And so I just thought that was one of the things that stuck with me from this.
I did too, Christina. And after I read that, I started looking at all of the portraits and at the eyes, because I have been struck looking at the, I think is it a gouache or a pastel? The one that's in our exhibition of James Baldwin as a young man, not
I think it's
Dark Rapture.
Is it the blue background?
Yes.
I think that's a pastel.
Because I keep being struck every time I look at that, are those eyes quite symmetrical? And finally, it was nice to have someone write about it. But my question is that a take on the, is it a reading of the work on the part of an art historian, or is there writing in Delaney's journals that supports that idea of, the eyes having different meaning?
There's nothing in, and the fact that you all are picking up on this, it's like, this is why these groups are such a pleasure, right? Like, this is why I wish all of my, students were at this level. It's such an astute set of observations. There's nothing in the journals that would be as kind of like dispositive evidence as this is why I do this, right? Or even like pay attention to eyes or anything like that. There is a fair amount of attention in the journals to inner world as separated from an outer world. So he'll write to a good friend of his who is also a painter named Larry Calcagno, talking about how life for him is mainly introspective, how life is internal, how he's moving into himself. So there is, I think, a real sense of a division between the internal world and the external world. And then what you get with these eyes, it lines up with that really nicely. It lines up, actually, Picasso and Matisse both do portraits where their eyes are just like, they are they are not matching eyes, right? They're not symmetrical. Often you'll get one too where it looks like one eye is black, one eye is white. So it's a sort of art historical trope. And I think that especially in the self-portraits where Delaney has this kind of asymmetrical ocularity, or whatever abstract phrase you want to use to describe it, he's really installing himself in this line of great modernist gods. You also, and I think that Delaney would have been exposed to this tradition after he starts making these paintings, so it doesn't really line up, but there is a tradition in Byzantine representations of Christ, most notably at, I think, the Hagia Sophia in Turkey, where Christ will be depicted. You notice it's called the Pantocrator tradition of representation, where the more you look at the Christ figure, the more you realize that this is not one person, this is two people fused into one. And there are all sorts of like theological ramifications of that. And it used to be thought that one side was for Christ's human, to represent his human side, and the other was to represent his divine side. And then the more recent theological and art historical thinking has been that one side is for his merciful side and one side is for judgment. And I love the idea that Beauford might have known about this tradition, but I think it's a bit of a stretch. He does write a fair amount about sort of integrating himself, pulling himself back together, bits that don't fit. So I think the notion of a fractured self is highly kind of germane when it comes to how Beaufort went through the world, both in a kind of W.E.B. Du Bois notion of double consciousness, of being Black, always existing as a kind of subject, first person, but always aware of an outside kind of mocking, judging world. So you get something like that. So I think there are multiple readings that get encapsulated in this kind of weird eyes situation.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes just to the richness of his practice.
Oh my God.
He really, I mean, again, he's just now kind of coming back onto the radar, but he was such a knowledgeable, he was such an artist. He spent so much time in museums and galleries, and this was the medium he thought in. And so you get such richness in his work.
Michelle had brought up in the chat about the estate and about the status of the estate. And I also was wondering, because of some of the things that Stephen Wicks and David Butler had said in their introductions about that, you know, they couldn't have collected before a certain time. And then you've mentioned that he died without a will. So Michelle had asked, what is the status of the estate? And I'm wondering, how does that affect then the way that people are able to view and collect his work?
As a lawyer,
and you may not know that. I don't know.
No, I know to some extent. Don't die without a will, especially if you're an artist, right? Just don't do it. It's not good for scholarship. So he dies without a will, and his brother, actually, Joseph, went over to Paris and brought all his stuff back, and that was amazing. The estate, because there's no will, all of the heirs have a share in it, which means that it's essentially a estate by large committee, which makes it challenging for scholars to get in. I worked for years to get in there. So it's, luckily they have an amazing attorney who's holding it together and is really doing right by the estate. But when you die without a will, and then it's all sorts of people with different interests saying who has access to the work, it gets challenging.
All right. Does anybody have any last questions?
Well, I just want to
go ahead.
Ask further. So is there a lot more artwork that is not publicly seen? I mean, what's involved in the rest of the estate, and are they holding on to it so they can sell it at Sotheby's? I mean, you know, any idea of what's going on?
I don't know what the estate's intentions are. I have only I met Beauford's nephew one time, which was amazing because he looks so much like Delaney. I had kind of this like fangirl moment of like, oh, I have dealt with the attorney who's amazing. There is a fair amount of work I mean, not a huge amount, a fair amount of works on paper. It's being shown now, it's being purchased now. And I don't, it's nothing like nefarious. It's just hard to get that many people to decide to do one thing. But we recently had a show, I think it just closed like maybe a month ago, of works on paper. Actually, and there were oils as well out of the estate. That was just a magnificent show, a chunk of portraits, a fair number of abstractions. The Michael Rosenberg Gallery, I think, bought a fair amount of that work. Rosenberg has been collecting his work since '89 and is really committed to Delaney's legacy, to his memory. He puts out these really beautiful catalogs. So a fair amount of it has gone there. And I think it remains to be seen what happens to the rest of it.
Did Baldwin own many of his works?
Yeah, he did.
He did.
He did. And had them. I mean, I think when I think about like pictures I've seen, because Baldwin moves it sort of later in his life to a villa in the south of France in a town called Saint-Paul-de-Vence. And Delaney loved to go visit him in St. Paul. And like when Delaney's mind started going, someone would go get Delaney and bring him down and they'd hang out. And when I think about pictures I've seen of the villa, there were at least 2 Delaneys hanging in Baldwin's office. And they also, if you're interested, there's a book. Baldwin wrote one children's book. It was a children's book that was not really for children, called Little Man, Little Man. And my friend of mine, Nick Boggs, who's just an amazing scholar working on a biography of James Baldwin, just helped to get that re-released in 2017. And it's just this beautiful book that I think Delaney was originally going to illustrate, but by the time that Baldwin got around to writing it, he was too far gone to do it. But the work it was actually Joran Kozak, a French artist, who wound up doing the illustrations. But they look like they've been really influenced by Delaney's watercolors and his works on paper. So I think that Baldwin had a fair amount of the work.
We'll have to check that out.
Yeah, it's so worth getting. You can get it on Amazon. It's just beautiful. There's this excellent introduction by Nick and someone else. And if you've read this catalog and you've read The Price of the Ticket, it's really engaged with those sources. So it's another way of kind of building on what you're seeing, and then to see really the overlap, because Joran Kozak knew Delaney, they were friends, and I think those works were so influenced by Delaney. If you're enjoying the show, you'll love Little Man. It's a way of really feeding into it. I realize I have to teach my own students in 3 minutes.
Yeah.
So I'm having trouble pulling myself away because you're such a great group, but I gotta go teach fighting words to some others.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. We really enjoyed hearing the biography. Just every time I hear something, I've learned something new. So thank you. We really appreciate your time today, and especially since you do have a class, and I told you we'd stay on topic and on time. Next month, we are reading I Always Loved You, a novel by Robin Oliveira, which is a hypothetical, fictional look at the possible relationship between Mary Cassatt and Edgar Degas. So have a look at that. It will be moderated by Barbara Pressman, one of our touring docents here at the museum. Thanks everybody for coming. I hope you have a great week, and I'll look forward to seeing you next month. Take care.